Well, wildfire season has begun here in Western Canada as thousands or millions have already figured out across the Canadian prairies. We've had our first whiff of smoke. Many folks thinking like, man, not again. We had such a smoky year last year. Here with me today to talk all about the wildfire situation in Western Canada is Mike Flannigan. He's a wildfire expert and professor at Thompson Rivers University. Thanks so much for joining me today, Mike.
Oh, great to be with you, Kyle.
Okay, so taking a look at the situation with the air quality across Western Canada here, we can clearly see that sort of cold front that's slashed its way south and lots of bad air across northwestern Alberta there. A lot of fires originating. You know, the smoke is coming up from this area here in the northeast part of BC, pushing south. And we've also got another little area of fires in eastern Saskatchewan, western Manitoba, pushing a plume to the south over the Winnipeg area. And now that smoke's all getting down into the northern states. So folks are going to start noticing what's going on out there.
Yeah, broad swath of smoke there for sure.
Still looks nice and clean there for you out in Kamloops. Hey, nice clean
Yeah,
air in the southern
blue
interior.
skies. Yeah, it's gorgeous, hot. Yeah.
Right on. So basically here, if we're looking at the satellite imagery from Saturday afternoon, we can see that smoke pushing its way south. So it was generated again up here. Most of it in that's pushing through, you know, Alberta, Saskatchewan's coming from the northeastern part of BC there, but it's definitely pushing south in a really thick band. Edmonton had really horrible air quality on Saturday, and it's pushed south into southern Alberta as well. But the smoke situation, for those who are interested, it looks like it's going to improve across much of the southern prairies where it's mostly heavily populated. That smoke should kind of retreat back to the north and, you know, disperse out of the south and become more localized to the north, at least for the next few days. If you want to check this out yourself, you can check out Environment Canada's. They have a smoke forecasting model called Firework, and that is where you can find that information. But let's actually break down what happened with the last few days here, Mike. What are we looking at? Like, this is a significant conflagration going on in the northeast BC.
It sure is. So we're looking at northeastern British Columbia, and all that gray is smoke. And you can see the smoke, the wind is quite strong and it's pushing that smoke towards the east. And you can see some white stuff in some of the fires, and that's cloud, cumulus, towering cumulus. I'm not sure if it got high enough to be a pyrocumulonimbus or fire-generated thunderstorm, but this is an indication of really intense fires, and that's no surprise. And the winds were strong southwest ahead of the cold front, flipping to a west to west-northwest to a northwest, and that means the flank of the fire becomes the head of the fire, which causes rapid growth.
Yeah, just extremely rapid growth and just generating a ton of smoke there. And you can tell, like you say, very wind driven. You know, it was just that sort of Thursday, Friday time frame where it was all it took. It was hot, dry, and windy ahead of this cold front. And it tends to be windy on both sides of these types of cold fronts. Hey, like you can clearly see just to the south of those smoke plumes, that thin white line there kind of demarcating that cold front as it's pushing to the south. And so, you know, this is a pretty typical kind of significant wildfire spread scenario for Western Canada, isn't it?
It sure is. And, you know, May is the busiest month for area burned in Alberta, and no other jurisdiction has that. In part, it's the weather, in part, it's the number of human-caused fires. And, you know, some work done by Dr. Cordy Teamstra found that for large escape fires, cold fronts factored in half of them. So cold fronts are really a critical aspect of fire spread days like we're seeing.
Definitely. And these sort of dry cold fronts, these ones, you know, many folks think of cold fronts, you know, they're associated with thunderstorms. In many cases, they can be, sometimes just other types of precipitation. But, you know, this is a very dry cold front. So there's no precipitation associated with it. Pretty much just a wind shift from southwest ahead of it to northwest behind it. And we'll look at that in a second here. You also mentioned pyrocumulus or potential for pyrocumulonimbus, I guess. Kind of for those who are kind of nerding out about what that is, that's a fire generated thunderstorm. And in order to be a true pyrocumulonimbus, you tend to need to have, you know, ice capped clouds, temperatures generally minus 38, minus 40 at the top. It could be generating lightning. And like you say, with the really strong winds, it tends to push those plumes over quite a bit. They don't get quite as deep as they are when the winds aren't as strong. But like you say, there is certainly some condensed cloud sitting on the top of that one plume coming out east of Fort Nelson there.
Sure is.
And then, of course, we were talking about like kind of the orientation of that cold front. We can see, you know, this front kind of pushing south across the prairies. But look at this orientation here in Alberta.
Yeah, you see this broad swath of smoke, that gray area. And in Saskatchewan's pushing from northwest to southeast. But in Alberta, especially against the mountains, it's pushing from the northeast to the southwest. So not all cold fronts are the same. And this is important, especially for mountainous areas where you get channeling in the valleys. And last year we had a fire outbreak in West Kelowna and Shuswap, and it was a cold front, but it was a bit different because it had upper air support, and the winds, typically after a cold front, they're really strong and gusty for a few hours, and then they start to die down. Last year, they didn't die down; they kept on blowing strong, and so that's why you have to, every situation deserves to be, looked at for the potential to, make a fire spread. So yeah, every situation's a bit different.
Yeah, absolutely. Pretty typical May case here with that dry cold front. And we can see, but even behind the cold front, there's still smoke being generated locally. And it's wrapping right up into this area of low pressure and will certainly get kind of vented to the east across North America in the coming days. On the Friday night, well, on the Friday in particular here from Canada here, this is Natural Resources Canada's fire risk map. Basically, the area that's been really heavily impacted by fires over the last year or so, Northwest Alberta, Northeast BC, Southern Northwest Territories, extreme fire danger in place there. That was certainly driven by the fire weather conditions, warm, dry, windy conditions. The other thing that's happening at this time of the year, though, is we've got what's called the spring dip in the boreal forest. There's very little in the way of moisture content up in the tree foliage and the needles and whatnot. So not only is the ground dry and the very dry conditions at the surface, very dry fuels, but the actual fuels, the trees themselves are very dry right now. So you can really easily propagate a fire with this kind of situation, right?
Yeah, and it's in tandem with what we call a spring window, and that's after the snow melts, you've got all that dead organic material from the previous fall until things green up all across Canada. This is prime time, and as you mentioned, Kyle, the conifer needles, the multi-year conifer needles are quite dry this time of year until the new green flesh comes out. So it's prime time for crown fires.
Absolutely.
A crown fire is where a fire spreads from the forest floor to the tops or crowns of the tree. That's the term crown fire.
Definitely. And you think about like some of the types of trees in the boreal forest, there's a lot of black spruce, and they have like tree boughs that tend to kind of like reach down toward the forest floor. You get those ladder fuels where the fire can quickly get up into the canopy, and then you have that high intensity crown fire like you're talking about, right?
Yeah. And this drought map is scary. And in part, the reason we're off to such a fast start in 2024 is in part because of 2023, the prolonged drought. We had a drought last year, and it's still with us, and in particular, Northeast BC, Northern Alberta, Southern Northwest Territories, and the zombie fires or the overwintering fires. That's another key aspect that's a legacy from 2023 and a reason why we're off to such a fast start.
Absolutely. Just horrible drought conditions there ongoing across the north. And also some agricultural drought here. We did get some like $1 million rains earlier in the week. Significant rains. They're not, like drought is a
billion dollar rains.
Billion dollar rains. Exactly. Multi-billions. Really well timed to, I'm sure a lot of folks had the seed in the ground already by that point in southern Alberta. Drought is a long-term creeping phenomena that doesn't just go away, phenomenon rather, that doesn't just go away overnight. We still need multiple, heavy precipitation events over a long period of time to really eradicate the drought. But that's going to certainly make a big difference across the agricultural regions. But, this ongoing, even if, when the green up happens, are we still looking at really dry tree foliage when you have this amount of, dry underneath all the trees?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's going to be dry all around until things start to green up. And yeah, this is a stressful period for trees and vegetation, and drought can kill. And dead vegetation is even more flammable than live vegetation.
Absolutely. And really, when it's dead, it's really kind of reactive to the relative humidity in the environment. Like if you have what's called crossover conditions, say your air temperature is higher than your relative humidity value, you have really low relative humidity, and it's really reactive to how dry the air is. And speaking of that, looking at the Fort Nelson weather late in the day on Friday, this is throughout the day Friday, basically, you can clearly see here as we get into the afternoon, unfortunately, if you can see on your screen here, it's in Fahrenheit. It gets up to 22 degrees Celsius, 72 Fahrenheit, with extremely low relative humidity values of under 20%. So we have several hours there of this crossover that we're talking about, huge spreads between, temperature and dew point. Your relative humidity is extremely low, and we've got strong winds, sort of 15 knot, 30 km/h southwesterlies ahead of the cold front. You can clearly see where that cold front came through. Big wind shift from the northwest there, 15, 20 knots out of the northwest with higher gusts. So you're, getting into that sort of 40 to 60 km/h winds with temperatures not dropping off too much, staying dry. And that's really what drove those fires on, especially Friday. It's like if you're trying to start a fire yourself, you're blowing on the fuels. And I mean, this is what's happening on the atmospheric scale here with you're mentioning the zombie fires from 2023. I mean, we're looking here at the area burned from 2023 on this image. These sort of greens and yellows are earlier in the season. The purples are from September in particular. So September, what happened on September 22nd, Mike?
It was later September, and it was the most active day for area burned in the record-smashing 2023 fire season, and it was largely due to numerous pyrocumulonimbus fire-generated thunderstorms, which are very high intensity, rapid growth, and you can see all the purple.
Absolutely there, and that was I think 400,000 hectares burned in a single burning period, right? On September 22nd, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, it's the most in 2023 or any other year that we have records for, going back about 22 years. So it was, end of September, not prime time for fire season, but yet we had a crazy day. Sign that our climate is changing.
Right. And so the other thing that we had through the winter was a very strong El Nino. Temperatures were higher than normal, precipitation lower than normal. And we had fires. These fires were smoldering I guess it would be in the peat, right? The peat's dry because of the drought, and they're smoldering, and they're not, there's no recovery because it's warm and dry through the winter. And here we go. If we look at the next image, this is, sort of our most recent area burned in the last 7 days, and just constellations of fires popping up again, and all related to those holdover fires from 2023.
So some of these fires, like Donny Creek, are the size of Prince Edward Island, and the fire season went so late last year, they didn't have a chance to do mop up, and we had active fires in British Columbia and Alberta in February. The fire season started very early, and it was announced in February 19th, I believe. So, this set the stage. They're just smoldering. The snow melts. You get some dry, windy weather like we just saw, and away we go. Because a lot of these hot spots are in the perimeter and they can spread into stuff that hasn't burned. The hot spots in the interior, it burned last year, so there's not much fuel to burn, so they're not going anywhere. But the ones on the perimeter, and why don't we put these fires out? Well, sometimes you don't want to. Our boreal forest survives and thrives in a regime of semi-regular, stand replacing high-intensity fires. It's just Mother Nature doing her thing, and where possible, we should let her do her thing, except for when it threatens communities like Fort Nelson right now, or Fort McMurray. But otherwise, perhaps we should just monitor some of these fires, and in some jurisdictions, that's exactly what we do.
Yeah, and of course, not great news for folks who don't like wildfire smoke. And I mean, if you think about how expensive it is to get out there and actually action these wildfires, and how remote they are, and how many hundreds or thousands of kilometers of fire line to action out there, it's not just something that you can just stroll up and pour some water on and put it out. And if you've got an ongoing raging crown fire, you can't get anywhere near that anyway. Your direct attack is not going to work. You can't be dropping fire retardant and water from aircraft flying over top. It'll just evaporate on the way down to it, right? So it's very tricky. You can't just stop nature from doing her thing.
No, the only thing you can do is indirect attack, which a planned ignition, a burnout operation in front of where the wildfire is spreading, and then that is backing against the wind, so it's lower intensity, manageable. The wildfire meets this burnout operation, and it's got no fuel. But you can't do it when the winds are shifting, because that's too dangerous, because then you could have two head fires instead of one.
Absolutely. And like we were talking about here, if you look at the BC Forestry website for the wildfire page, you can see that pretty much every single one of these, save for the Fort Nelson, the Parker Creek fire, every one of these active fires is associated with a holdover fire from 2023. And all of these fires as well, you can check for yourself there on the website, are lightning caused fires. And one of the reasons why they grow so large are very remote. They're triggered by lightning and they're off to the races really quickly. So the smoke that we're currently getting across Western Canada in general, especially through Alberta, Saskatchewan, all came from fires that started in 2023 as a result of lightning.
Right, with the exception of the Parker Lake fire, which we hear, current reports suggest it was a power line, that a branch hit a power line and started a fire, and right close to town, which is a real concern, and that's why it's evacuated.
Absolutely. It's our one wildfire of note in British Columbia as of Sunday. And we can see that area burned recently. That, this is an example of, the fires are largely burning, say, north and east of Fort Nelson. You're thinking, everything's all right. And suddenly the whole town is on evacuation alert and then evacuation order. And we are perilously close to the west side of Fort Nelson, a little bit concerned for Monday, given the westerly winds in the forecast.
Yeah, strong westerly winds are forecast tomorrow. And one has to be a little careful with these hotspot maps.
Yep.
Because the locations are approximate, and sometimes the plume is so hot it triggers the sensors to think it's a fire, where really it's just the smoke from the fire. So, but they're a ballpark evidence of a very active fire very close to Fort Nelson.
Yeah, a very important point, Mike, because these maps are starting to be widely shared on social media. In northern Alberta here, we can also see there's 45 active fires in the province, 2 out of control. And, we got this one mutual aid fire burning northeast of Grand Prairie, and the other one southwest of Fort McMurray. And that one's got the entire city, and including Sapere Creek Estates to the southeast of the city there, on evacuation alert. If we look at the actual fire burned area, again, just satellite indicated, we got pixels here northeast of Grand Prairie. Looks like it's mostly surrounded by that very dry farmland burning into the river valley, where there's more coniferous trees in there, though, I think.
Yeah, and farmland burns at this time of year, spring and fall, when it's green. During the summer it doesn't burn, but right now it's fair game.
And especially it's because it's so dry up there. They missed out on all that recent precipitation. Not only that, if it's hot, dry, and windy, you might have had significant precipitation, but those fine fuels can just dry out really quickly, like even in a day after a big rain, right?
Well, the grass can cure in an hour. You can go from a rain to ready to burn. Okay, so almost instantaneous.
Right. And so our McMurray wildfire number 17 here, southwest of Fort McMurray, about 16 kilometers southwest of the city as of Sunday afternoon. We can see again, satellite indicated the burning is in this area. But Mike, I had a question for you there. If you look at the Sentinel satellite imagery, I gathered this from, this is April 25th. The fire is burning in this zone right here. You can see some nice dark greens here. This product that we're looking at is called the NDVI, or Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, just basically a sign of the health of the vegetation, the greenness of it. So these areas of green here are certainly unburned forest areas. We can see lighter greens over Fort McMurray. If we look at a slightly different product, the moisture index, we can also see that where the fire is currently burning in this area here, definitely green coniferous forest in this zone, but you can clearly see the footprint of the Horse River fire in 2016, which of course burned the majority of Fort McMurray. Is there a possibility still that this fire could make a run toward the city when you have very little in the way of, at least standing green between the fire and Fort McMurray?
So generally, when an area burns, it's unlikely to reburn for 10 or 20 years. But if things are extreme, it can still burn. So, caution is still warranted. And as you're showing, even though there's less fuel, it tends to be dry, okay, and is showing up in this figure because it gets more sunlight, it gets more wind exposure than the forests do. It won't support a crown fire, so it's lower intensity and easier to manage than a running crown fire, but still be on alert. It still can burn.
Okay, yeah. So perhaps a little bit of hope there. let's just hope that we don't get any extreme, fire weather, strong winds. So actually breaking down the causes of the fires in Alberta, we'll just touch on this quickly because there's a lot of talk on social media about what's causing these fires. Where's this smoke coming from? We know that the majority of the smoke that we're breathing this year and last year for that matter, but this year right now, the majority of the smoke that you're smelling in Alberta is coming from wildfires that started in 2023, lightning-caused fires. Typically, you'll get about 2/3 of all fires in Alberta will be human caused, 33% will be lightning caused. Last year, it was actually slightly less human caused, more lightning caused. We had a whopping 2.2 million hectares burned, and over 1.7 million of that area burned was generated by lightning. That's almost 80% of that total area burned was due to lightning. So most of the smoke being kicked off by these fires from lightning fires. We can also see a breakdown here, given this is right on the Alberta government website. You can see the breakdown of the last 5 years. Very handy product here. We can see that, of the human-caused fires, they break it down for us. Of specifically, a lot of folks are interested in the question of human-caused and particularly intentionally human-caused arson fires or otherwise incendiary fires here, saying we had 125. And of course, their clause here is a wildfire that's been intentionally lit, which includes, but it's not limited to arson. So it could also be, target shooting, or it could be fireworks, or it could be lighting some building
Burning
on fire.
garbage. Yeah, there's all sorts of reasons for incendiary fires. So besides arson.
Right. And so the government also released a stat that we had 91 fires were actually arson generated, 262 hectares burned as a result of those. So a very small number. And that's likely the result of these fires being started near communities where they're more easily actioned as opposed to, say, a lightning fire. But that is 1/10,000th of the area burned last year in total. So you're not smelling arson smoke in general. That is not to downplay the potential for arson fires. Of course, if it was started at the wrong time in the wrong place, it could be highly impactful. But the statistics don't show that it is a very significant driver of the fire and the smoke across Alberta. Now, if we're actually looking at the forecast in the next 10 days or so, we're trending slightly cooler than average across much of the boreal and Western Canada. Also, not too much in the way of really strong winds, but unfortunately, we're still seeing that dry signal continuing across the area that's been impacted at the moment.
Yeah, and that's one of the concerns. That there is wind tomorrow for northeastern British Columbia, northern Alberta, but it's so dry that even if there isn't wind, the fires can just get going, and you can develop some of those column-based fires,
right,
which can lead to pyro-CBs. So the dice is loaded for action. It's just looking for the right conditions.
And you can still have extreme fire behavior with temperatures below 20 Celsius if the relative humidity is low enough and you're burning through some thick fuel, right?
Yeah, I mean, we like to say hot, dry, windy, but the hot's not required. It helps, but it's not necessary. If you're dry and you have ignition, it can burn and will burn.
Yeah, we've definitely seen that with grass fires in southern Alberta during the winter time when you've got a Chinook wind and maybe it's 10, 12 degrees Celsius, not too warm by winter standards, but not by summer standards. But you got that raging wind. You can blow, a wildfire across some grasslands in really short order.
The Grantham Fire of 1997 consumed, it ran about 60 kilometers in a day. It was a Chinook condition, and it burned rangeland, farmland. It just raced and finally stopped at the town of Grantham. That's the term, Grantham Fire.
Yeah, and then of course you get the bare soil and the soil erosion that happens as a result of that. What's to come in the coming months here? Well, pretty much across the board, all of our long-range forecast models are showing warmer than average conditions through the summer. So regardless of whether we get a lot of precipitation, you're going to have that increased evaporation potential, right? I mean, this does tend to kind of, drought tends to beget more drought. And if it's really warm, we really need a lot more precipitation to offset the effects of the warmer temperatures, right?
Yeah. The warmer it is, generally, the more fire we see, all things considered. So this is setting the stage for perhaps an active season. But the other side of the card is precipitation. What's that what's that say, Kyle?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're coming into our climatological, wet period, the June monsoon, so-called, across parts of Alberta. By the way, this is from Environment and Climate Change Canada, their May, June, July outlook. It's on the Public Weather Office website. Their precipitation outlook, again, take this as a grain of salt, but we can see here southern interior BC, southern Alberta, wet signal, dry signal across the north. Of course, if this played out this way, of course, you'd see the continuation of oh, we're running out of time. We'll be fine though. Across the north here, we can see that it's quite dry, whereas in the south, this would be good for at least delaying the onset of the interior fire season. It'd be good for the agricultural sector in the south.
But as one seasonal forecaster told me recently, trying to forecast for a season outside of the equatorial areas, they suck. So,
especially in the summer.
Yeah, especially precipitation. And yeah, and here's the example, how different they can be.
Exactly. So this is from the American, the same, May, June, July timeframe. If this played out, this would be excellent for the agricultural sector. Mixed signals of precipitation across the boreal. This is pretty dry in parts here. This would be quite concerning, especially in the interior. I mean, we've been having like low 30s temperatures in recent days there. I hope we're not seeing an early start in the southern interior fire season as well.
Yeah, typically fire season starts in July here, though the last few years can be June as well. But yeah, that doesn't look good. But
yeah, and then our June, July, August, same thing, continuing that overall trend, pretty dry in BC, wetter toward east of the Rockies. But then compare this, or contrast this rather, with the Canadian. It's pretty much the exact opposite signal there, with a much drier than average to the south and wetter than average across the forest, the boreal region. So, I mean, this would be perhaps better for the fire season as well. The June, July, August forecast, very similar, continuing that trend. Not good for the agricultural sector, but that being said, we did see some improvements in our snowpacks there recently and had that good rain event. So hopefully that'd hold us over in an event like this. But again, just shows long range forecasting, especially in the summer when we don't have those really strong climate drivers like El Nino, La Nina. One thing I guess I would say is that coming out of strong El Ninos into La Ninas in the past, during that transition, we've often seen summers in Western Canada trend wet. So we still have time, especially given that June is typically our wet season. Will tend to be, late May, June, wettest in this region. And as you push northward, it's kind of mid to late June into July, wetter up north. So, we might still be seeing active conditions for another month or so, but hopefully that June monsoon kicks in.
Let's hope.
And finally, here from the European, we can see this would not be good for
Yikes.
Exactly. Very drier than average across the north, persisting a little bit wetter in the prairies there, but dry in BC, dry where it's already dry. Let's hope this does not come to pass as well. They're June, July, August, persistent dry conditions across the region. So really hoping that doesn't happen.
Yeah, that would be a very active fire season for BC, Alberta, Southern Northwest Territories.
Absolutely. So, basically breaking it down, what are some actionables? What can we take away from this discussion?
Well, be careful with fire. Canada, almost half the fires are started by people. And, this is the spring window. This is prime time for human-caused fires. If you see a fire, report it right away, because even on the extreme days, if you get to a fire when it's small, we can put it out. So observe fire bans, forest closures, etc. Stay safe.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for joining me today, Mike. It was great chatting with you.
As always.
Okay, we'll talk next time.
Cheers.